Germany, 2014. Part 1. The Diagnosis. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly in the hospital waiting room, casting a harsh, cold glow on the sterile white walls. Mark Braun sat slumped in a plastic chair that was as unforgiving as the news he had just received. His normally confident posture was broken, his back hunched, and his hands gripping the armrest tightly, his knuckles white from the pressure. Time seemed to stand still, as though the world outside had paused, leaving him trapped in a suffocating silence. The usual noises of the hospital, paging systems, muffled conversations, the occasional footsteps of nurses, seemed distant, like echoes in a dream he couldn't escape. His heart pounded in his chest, a deep, painful thudding that reverberated in his ears. He had always thought of himself as strong, resilient, able to weather any storm. But nothing in his life had prepared him for this. The doctor's words, spoken just moments ago, hung in the air like a dark cloud, suffocating any hope he might have clung to. Your daughter, Emma, she has a rare degenerative disease. I'm afraid it's terminal. We're looking at weeks, perhaps less. Weeks? Less? Mark's mind reeled, trying to comprehend the enormity of what he had just heard. How could this be happening? Emma, his bright, energetic, and innocent little girl, was the very definition of life itself. She was always running through the house with her pigtails bouncing, always laughing, always drawing pictures of flowers, rainbows, and smiling suns. She was his world, his anchor after Sophie, his wife, had died in that tragic accident 2 years ago. And now, that world was crumbling, piece by piece, before his very eyes. He stared down at the drawing Emma had given him the day before. It was simple, the kind of innocent art only a child could create, a picture of the two of them holding hands, standing in the middle of a park. The sun was shining, the trees were full of leaves, and she had drawn the two of them smiling, the kind of wide, carefree smiles that only children can imagine. The crayon lines were shaky, imperfect, but to Mark, it was a masterpiece. Now, the bright colors of the drawing felt like a cruel contrast to the stark reality he was living. How could life, with all its vibrant beauty, turn so dark so quickly? His heart tightened as he ran his fingers over the paper, trying to hold onto the image of happiness, of innocence that it represented. Mark blinked, his throat dry, and looked up at the clock on the wall. It ticked away with an indifferent precision, as if mocking him, counting down the minutes of his daughter's life with no regard for the devastation he felt inside. It was a twisted irony, time moving forward when all he wanted was for it to stop, to freeze this moment so he wouldn't have to face what came next. The waiting room felt impossibly large, the space around him hollow, as if he were the only person in the universe. He had never felt so alone. He had no one to turn to, no one who could help him make sense of the impossible. The familiar ache of Sophie's absence settled in his chest, a dull, constant pain that never really went away. She should have been here, by his side, holding his hand, telling him they would get through this together. But she wasn't. And now, he faced the unimaginable, the loss of his daughter, completely and utterly alone. The door to the waiting room opened with a soft creak, breaking the heavy silence that had enveloped him. He didn't look up at first, his mind too consumed by the overwhelming grief and fear. But the sound of approaching footsteps drew his attention. A nurse, Greta, walked toward him, her face a blend of compassion and exhaustion, the kind that comes from years of working in a place where life and death are daily companions. Greta had been one of the nurses caring for Emma since she was admitted to the hospital. She had seen families in Mark's position before, parents teetering on the edge of despair, clinging to the smallest slivers of hope as they watched their children slip away. But there was something about Mark that moved her deeply. Perhaps it was the haunted look in his eyes, the way he sat there, staring at his daughter's drawing, as if it were the only thing tethering him to reality. "Mr. Braun," she said softly, her voice a gentle disruption to the storm raging inside him. She approached slowly, not wanting to intrude, but feeling compelled to offer some comfort. "I can't imagine how difficult this must be for you. I'm so sorry." Her words, though spoken with kindness, felt like a knife twisting in his heart. He nodded, barely able to muster a response, his voice caught in the tightness of his throat. Greta hesitated for a moment, searching for the right words. She had seen people in Mark's position before, desperate, lost, and searching for answers that medicine couldn't provide. She was a Christian, her faith deep and unwavering. And though she knew not everyone shared her beliefs, she had witnessed moments where faith had brought comfort, and sometimes, even miracles. "Mr. Braun," she began again, more cautiously this time, "I know this may not be something you're comfortable with, and I completely understand if it's not what you want to hear right now. But sometimes, when there's nothing else left to do, prayer can bring comfort. I've seen it help in ways I can't explain." Mark's brow furrowed, his mind snapping back to the present moment. Prayer. The word tasted foreign on his tongue, as if it didn't belong in his vocabulary. He had never been a man of faith. His parents had raised him to believe in what could be seen, touched, and proven. Religion, God. Those were things he had left behind in his childhood, relics of stories that no longer held any meaning for him. I don't believe in that," he said, shaking his head. "I don't believe in God." Greta didn't push, didn't try to convince him. She knew better than to force faith on someone who wasn't ready to receive it. But there was something in Mark's eyes, something that told her he wasn't completely closed off. It was desperation, the kind that makes a person question everything they thought they knew. "I understand," she replied gently. "But if you ever feel like it, even just to try, sometimes faith can be all we have when everything else seems lost." With that, she gave him a small, sympathetic smile and left the room, leaving Mark alone with his thoughts. Mark's gaze drifted back to the drawing in his hand, his mind swirling with confusion, anger, and despair. Prayer? It seemed absurd. What good would it do? What could some invisible, unproven deity possibly do for his daughter that the doctors, with all their years of training and expertise, couldn't? He had always believed that people turned to religion out of fear, as a way to cope with the things they couldn't control. He had never needed it before, and he wasn't about to start now. But as he sat there, alone in the empty waiting room, with the weight of the world crushing down on him, a small, nagging thought crept into his mind. What if? What if there was something out there, something bigger than him, something that could help his little girl? It was a foolish thought, one he tried to push away, but it lingered, stubbornly refusing to be dismissed. Time passed slowly, each minute dragging on like an eternity. Mark stayed in the waiting room, lost in a sea of hopelessness, until finally, he couldn't take it anymore. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the tiled floor, and made his way down the sterile, white hallway toward Emma's room. His heart pounded in his chest with every step, a mixture of fear and anger boiling inside him. He wasn't ready to believe, but as he reached for the door handle, he knew one thing. He would do anything to save his daughter. Part 2. A Father's Struggle. The room was dimly lit, with only a soft glow from the overhead lights reflecting off the sterile, white hospital walls. The machines monitoring Emma's vital signs beeped steadily, their rhythmic sounds the only indication that life was still pulsing through her small, fragile body. Mark sat by her bedside, his eyes red and swollen from hours of holding back tears. The smell of antiseptic clung to the air, mixing with the faint scent of the fresh flowers someone had placed on the windowsill in an attempt to bring some semblance of normalcy to an otherwise lifeless room. The sight of his daughter lying so still, so pale, tore at Mark's soul in ways he couldn't describe. She had always been so full of energy, always running, always laughing. Now, her face was drained of color, her lips slightly parted as she struggled to breathe with the help of the machines. Her once bright eyes, which had been filled with curiosity and wonder, were now closed, as if she were slipping further away from him with each passing minute. Mark reached out and took her small hand in his, gently cradling it as if it were the most fragile thing in the world. Her fingers, once so lively and quick to grasp his in play, were now limp, cold to the touch. He had never felt more helpless. As her father, he had always taken pride in protecting her, in being the one who could fix anything. But now there was nothing he could do. No words he could say, no actions he could take that would change the reality they were facing. The doctors had told him there was nothing more they could do. Emma's disease was progressing faster than they had anticipated, and though they had tried every possible treatment, every experimental drug, nothing had worked. It was as if her body had already given up, surrendering to the inevitable. They had explained it to him in medical terms he had struggled to understand, but the message had been clear. Emma was dying, and they had no answers. Mark felt a tightness in his chest, the weight of his failure pressing down on him like an invisible force. He had failed to protect his daughter. As a father, he was supposed to be her shield, her strength, but all he could do now was sit by her side and watch his life slowly slipped away from her. It was a nightmare he couldn't wake up from, a reality he couldn't escape. His thoughts wandered back to Greta, the nurse who had spoken to him earlier that day. Her words about prayer echoed in his mind, stirring something deep within him. He had dismissed it at the time, rejecting the notion that prayer could offer any real solution to the problem they were facing. But now, as he sat here, alone in the quiet room, with nothing but the steady beeping of the machines and the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, he found himself questioning everything he had once believed. Prayer. He had never been one to rely on faith. He had built his life on logic, on reason, on things that could be explained and proven. But now, all of that seemed meaningless. What good was logic when the most important person in his life was dying, and there was nothing he could do to stop it? The room felt impossibly cold, the weight of grief hanging in the air like a thick fog. He looked at Emma again, her small chest rising and falling with the help of the ventilator. Her little body looked so fragile, so small in that oversized hospital bed, surrounded by machines and tubes that seemed to consume her. It wasn't right. This wasn't how things were supposed to be. Mark clenched his jaw, his hands tightening around Emma's. He had spent the last few weeks in a constant state of denial, trying to convince himself that somehow, someway, things would get better. But now, faced with the undeniable reality of the situation, he couldn't keep lying to himself. He was losing her, and no amount of reason or science was going to change that. A tear slipped down his cheek, followed by another, until the floodgates opened and he couldn't hold back anymore. He had been trying so hard to stay strong for Emma, to be the rock she needed. But now, in the stillness of the night, with no one around to see him break, he allowed himself to fall apart. The sobs came quietly at first, his shoulders shaking as he bowed his head over her hand, his tears falling onto her tiny fingers. The pain in his chest was unbearable, a physical ache that felt like it was tearing him apart from the inside. How could this be happening? How could the universe be so cruel? He had already lost Sophie, his wife, his partner, his anchor. And now, the thought of losing Emma too was more than he could bear. He had nothing left to give, nothing left to fight with. And yet, as he sat there, his heart breaking, something shifted inside him. A small, almost imperceptible whisper of hope. It was faint, barely a flicker in the darkness, but it was there. Greta's words came back to him, unbidden. Sometimes, when there's nothing else left, prayer is all we have. Mark lifted his head, his eyes red and swollen from crying. He stared at Emma, at the tubes and wires connected to her, and a sudden wave of desperation washed over him. He had never been a man of faith, never believed in anything he couldn't see or touch. But right now, he was willing to try anything, if it meant even the slightest chance of saving his daughter. His breath hitched in his throat as he considered the absurdity of what he was about to do. He wasn't a religious man. He hadn't prayed in years, decades even. But here, in this room, with nothing left but the slow, ticking clock of his daughter's life, he made a decision. With trembling hands, he let go of Emma's, stood from the chair, and kneeled beside her bed. The linoleum floor was hard and cold beneath his knees, but he barely noticed. His heart pounded in his chest, a steady, frantic beat that filled the quiet room as he bowed his head. his hands clasped together tightly. He didn't know what to say. He had no idea how to pray or what words would make a difference. But in that moment, all he could do was speak from the deepest part of his soul. God, his voice cracked, barely above a whisper. It felt strange, foreign, to address a deity he wasn't sure even existed. But he pressed on, his desperation outweighing his doubt. I don't know if you're there. I don't know if you listen to people like me, but please, if you can hear me, help her. Help my little girl. Don't take her away from me. I don't know what I'll do without her. The tears came again, but he didn't stop. His words were raw, unpracticed, but they came from a place of pure love and fear. I know I've never believed, he continued, his voice thick with emotion. I know I've always been skeptical, always thought that faith was something for other people. But I don't have anything else. I don't have anyone else. Please just give her a chance. Let her live. I'll do anything. His hands shook as he wiped his tears on the sleeve of his shirt, his body trembling with the weight of the prayer. He knelt there for what felt like hours, pouring out his heart to a God he wasn't sure was listening, but hoping, praying, that somehow, in some way, his words would make it to the heavens. The room was silent, save for the quiet hum of the machines and the steady beep of Emma's heart monitor. Mark stayed there, kneeling beside her, until his legs were numb and his tears had dried. He didn't know what he expected. Some sign, some miracle, but nothing came. The room remained still, the air heavy with the weight of his unanswered plea. Eventually, exhausted, he rose from the floor and sat back down in the chair beside Emma's bed. His body ached, his mind was numb, but for the first time in days, he felt a small sliver of peace. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him going. He didn't know if his prayer had been heard, didn't know if it would change anything. But in that quiet room, with his daughter lying beside him, he had done the only thing he could. He had surrendered. And now, all he could do was wait. Part 3. A glimmer of hope. The first light of dawn filtered through the narrow windows of the hospital corridor, casting long shadows on the walls. The air was crisp and cold, carrying with it the sterile scent of antiseptic that had become all too familiar to Mark over the past few days. He stood just outside Emma's room, leaning heavily against the wall, his eyes bloodshot and puffy from lack of sleep. The weight of the previous night still hung over him like a thick fog. His tearful prayer, his desperate plea to a God he wasn't sure even existed. The hours had bled together in a haze of exhaustion and grief. And now, with the first light of morning, came a strange stillness. Inside Emma's room, the rhythmic beeping of the monitors continued its steady pace, a sound that had become both a comfort and a torment to Mark. Each beep reminded him that she was still here, still fighting, but it also underscored the fragility of her life. He had spent the night by her side, watching her breathe, hoping against hope that something, anything, would change. Mark rubbed his face with his hands, the stubble on his chin rough against his palms. He hadn't showered in days, hadn't eaten much either. His body was running on sheer willpower, fueled by a primal need to be with his daughter in her darkest hour. Sleep had been elusive, and when it came, it was filled with nightmares, visions of Emma slipping away, of the machines going silent. He couldn't shake the fear, the overwhelming sense that time was running out. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, and Mark lifted his head, his weary eyes focusing on the approaching figure. Dr. Fisher, the lead physician on Emma's case, was walking toward him with a furrowed brow, holding a folder of charts. Mark's heart sank. He had seen that look before, a mixture of confusion and caution. It was the look doctors gave when they didn't have answers, when they were as baffled by the situation as the patient's family. Dr. Fisher stopped in front of Mark, his expression serious but not unkind. He opened the folder in his hands, glancing down at the papers as if he needed to double-check what he was about to say. "Mr. Braun," the doctor began, his voice low and measured, "we've just received the results from Emma's latest tests." Mark's stomach tightened. He could feel the blood drain from his face, his hands suddenly clammy. He braced himself for the worst, for the confirmation that his worst fears were about to come true. "We ran the tests several times to be sure," Dr. Fisher continued, his brow furrowed in concentration. But it appears that Emma's condition is improving. The words hit Mark like a jolt of electricity, cutting through the thick fog of despair that had clouded his mind. For a moment, he wasn't sure he had heard correctly. Improving, Mark echoed, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking the word aloud might shatter the fragile hope that had suddenly sprung to life within him. Dr. Fisher nodded, his expression still cautious but tinged with a hint of surprise. Yes, her blood work shows a significant reduction in the markers we've been monitoring. It's unexpected. The disease seems to be regressing. Mark blinked, trying to process what he was hearing. Regression? How was that possible? Just days ago, the doctors had told him there was no hope, that Emma's condition was beyond treatment. He had sat in that very hallway, listening to them explain how her body was shutting down, how the disease was consuming her from the inside out. And now, they were telling him that things were changing, for the better? He searched Dr. Fisher's face for some kind of explanation, something that would make sense of this sudden shift in his daughter's condition. But the doctor seemed as perplexed as he was. "We've consulted with specialists," Dr. Fisher said, his tone still careful. "But we can't find a medical explanation for this. We've never seen a case like Emma's improve this quickly, especially not in the advanced stage she was in." Mark's heart raced, his mind spinning with 1,000 questions. Could it be? Could this be the answer to the prayer he had whispered in the quiet darkness of Emma's room? He had prayed for a miracle, for something, anything, to save his daughter. And now, standing in the sterile hallway of this Berlin hospital, he found himself facing the possibility that his prayer had been answered. But how? How could something like this happen? He wasn't a man of faith, had never believed in miracles or divine intervention. And yet, here he was, being told that his daughter, his beautiful, fragile Emma, was defying the odds. Mark felt his knees weaken, and he leaned against the wall for support. His breath came in shallow, ragged gasps as he tried to wrap his mind around what was happening. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if he was awake or still trapped in one of the countless nightmares that had plagued him since Emma's diagnosis. Dr. Fisher, sensing Mark's overwhelm, placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Mr. Braun, I know this is a lot to take in. We're continuing to monitor Emma closely, and we'll be running more tests in the coming days. But for now, it's safe to say that we're seeing real improvement." Mark nodded slowly, his throat tight with emotion. He wanted to ask more questions, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. His mind was racing, a torrent of thoughts and emotions flooding through him, leaving him speechless. The doctor gave him a sympathetic nod before turning to leave, but not before offering one final word of encouragement. "We'll keep you updated on her progress. But for now, try to rest. Things are looking better." As Dr. Fisher walked away, Mark stood frozen in the hallway, his mind still grappling with the enormity of what he had just heard. Could this really be happening? Was Emma truly getting better? He turned and looked through the small window of her room, his heart swelling with a cautious, fragile hope. There she was, his little girl, lying peacefully in her bed, her chest rising and falling with the help of the machines. She looked the same, pale, frail, but now there was something different, a glimmer of life that hadn't been there before. Mark took a deep breath, his body still trembling with a mixture of fear and awe. He hadn't expected this. He had spent the night preparing himself for the worst, for the inevitable heartbreak that would come when Emma's body finally gave out. But now there was a chance that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. He stepped closer to the door, his hand resting on the cool metal of the handle, his mind still spinning. Was this the result of his prayer? Had God really heard him? Or was this just a fluke, a strange, inexplicable twist of fate? Mark didn't know. He didn't have the answers. But as he stood there, staring at his daughter's small, fragile form, he felt something he hadn't felt in weeks: hope. It was a fragile hope, delicate and easily shattered, but it was there nonetheless. It flickered in his chest like a small flame, giving him the strength to keep going, to keep believing that maybe, just maybe, things were going to get better. He turned away from the door, his mind still buzzing with questions. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he allowed himself to believe in the possibility of a miracle. Part 4. Unexplainable. The clatter of trays and the murmur of soft conversations filled the hospital cafeteria, blending with the steady hum of the coffee machine behind the counter. Mark sat at a small, round table by the window, staring blankly at the untouched cup of coffee in front of him. The steam rose lazily from the cup, but Mark barely noticed it. His mind was elsewhere, swirling with confusion, disbelief, and a strange sense of hope that he was almost afraid to acknowledge. He had been sitting there for over an hour, trying to process the news that Dr. Fisher had delivered that morning. Emma's condition was improving. Those words replayed in his mind over and over again, but they felt foreign, as if they belonged to someone else's story, not his. He had spent weeks preparing for the worst, bracing himself for the inevitable goodbye that he had feared was just around the corner. And now, out of nowhere, the doctors were telling him that she was getting better. Mark leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his hands pressed against his temples. It didn't make sense. He had spent hours researching Emma's condition, combing through medical journals and online forums, looking for any shred of hope. Everything he had read pointed to the same conclusion. Once the disease had progressed to the stage Emma was in, there was no going back. There were no treatments left, no cures, no miracles. And yet here they were. The cafeteria around him felt distant, the chatter of doctors and nurses fading into the background as Mark's thoughts consumed him. His mind raced with questions, each one more desperate than the last. Was this really happening? Could the test be wrong? Was this just a temporary improvement, a cruel twist of fate that would give him hope only to snatch it away again? He shook his head, trying to clear the fog of uncertainty that clouded his thoughts. He needed answers, but none of the doctors had been able to give him one. Not a medical one, at least. The soft sound of footsteps approaching the table pulled Mark out of his thoughts. He looked up to see Greta, the nurse who had spoken to him about prayer just days before, standing beside him with a tray in her hands. Her expression was calm, her eyes filled with the same quiet compassion she had shown him from the beginning. "May I join you?" she asked gently, her voice a welcome contrast to the whirlwind of chaos in his mind. Mark nodded, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. Greta set her tray down and took a seat, her movements deliberate and unhurried, as if she could sense the fragile state he was in. She didn't speak right away, allowing the silence to settle between them as she sipped her tea. After a moment, she looked at Mark, her eyes searching his face. "You've heard the news, haven't you?" Mark swallowed, his throat dry. "Yeah," he said, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "The doctors, they said she's improving, but they don't know why." Greta nodded slowly, her gaze steady. "Sometimes there are things we can't explain." Mark let out a bitter laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Things we can't explain? That's an understatement. They told me she didn't have a chance. They said there was nothing they could do. And now, suddenly, she's getting better? It doesn't make sense." Greta placed her hands on the table, folding them neatly in front of her. "Mark," she began, her tone gentle but firm, "you prayed for her. You opened your heart, even if just for a moment, and asked for something greater than what the doctors could offer. And now, you're seeing the result of that faith." Mark stared at her, his chest tightening with a mixture of disbelief and something else, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Could it really be that simple? Could the act of praying, of surrendering to something beyond his understanding, have brought about this change? "I don't know," Mark began, his voice trailing off as he struggled to find the right words. "I don't know if I believe in that. I mean, I prayed, but I didn't really think it would do anything. I didn't know what else to do." Greta's smile was kind, patient. "That's the thing about faith," she said softly. "It doesn't require you to have all the answers. It doesn't even require you to fully believe. Sometimes, all it takes is the willingness to try, to open your heart, even for a moment, and allow yourself to hope for something more." Mark's hands clenched around the edge of the table, his mind racing. He had spent his entire life believing that everything had a rational explanation, that the world operated on logic and reason. And yet, here he was faced with something that defied all of that. The doctors had no explanation for Emma's sudden improvement. They had run the tests multiple times, consulted with specialists, and still, they were at a loss. And then there was the prayer, the whispered, desperate plea he had made in the quiet of the night, when all hope seemed lost. He had meant it to be a prayer, not really. It had been more of a last-ditch effort, a cry for help when there was nothing else left to try. But now, sitting in the hospital cafeteria with Greta across from him, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, his words had been heard. But why? Mark asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why would God listen to me? I've never believed in him. I've never prayed, never gone to church. I've spent my whole life dismissing the idea of faith. Why now? Greta leaned forward, her gaze steady and filled with a quiet wisdom. God doesn't care about how many times you've prayed in the past, or whether you've followed every rule or ritual. What matters is your heart. In that moment, when you were at your lowest, you reached out. You opened yourself up to the possibility of something greater. And that's enough. Mark stared down at the table, his mind spinning. It was all so overwhelming, so impossible to comprehend. The logical part of him still fought against it, still clung to the belief that there had to be some other explanation. But the part of him that had whispered that desperate prayer, the part of him that had knelt by Emma's bed and begged for her life, couldn't ignore what was happening. He glanced out the window, watching as the morning light filtered through the trees outside. The world seemed to be moving forward, oblivious to the miracle unfolding inside the walls of the hospital. But for Mark, everything had changed. I don't know if I can believe in miracles, Mark admitted, his voice heavy with uncertainty. I don't know if I'm ready to believe in God. Greta smiled softly, her eyes filled with understanding. That's okay, she said. You don't have to have all the answers right now. Faith isn't about knowing everything. It's about trusting, even when you don't understand. And sometimes that trust is enough to carry us through. Mark nodded slowly, his mind still grappling with the enormity of it all. He didn't know what the future held, didn't know if Emma's improvement would last, or if this was just a brief moment of hope in a long battle. But for the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Hope. It wasn't a certainty, wasn't a guarantee that everything would be okay. But it was there, fragile and delicate, like a seed planted in the dark soil of his heart, waiting to grow. Greta stood up from the table, her movements slow and deliberate. Whatever happens next, Mark, know that you're not alone in this. Whether you believe in miracles or not, whether you believe in God or not, there are people who care about you and Emma, and that matters. Mark looked up at her, a lump forming in his throat. He didn't have the words to express the gratitude he felt, didn't know how to thank her for the quiet strength she had offered him during this nightmare. But as she gave him one last gentle smile and walked away, he felt a sense of peace settle over him, a peace he hadn't felt in a long time. He sat there for a while longer, staring out the window, watching as the world outside continued to move. And for the first time in weeks, Mark allowed himself to believe in the possibility of a future. One where Emma might be okay, where life might go on, not as it was before, but in a new, unexpected way. And maybe, just maybe, there was something out there, something greater than himself, that had heard his prayer after all. Part 5. A New Beginning. The sun streamed through the large windows of Emma's hospital room, casting soft golden light over the sterile white walls. It was a warm, peaceful morning, a stark contrast to the dark, cold nights Mark had endured over the past weeks. The sounds of the hospital, nurses chatting, machines beeping softly, footsteps in the hallway, felt distant, almost muffled, as if the room had become a quiet sanctuary, insulated from the chaos outside. Mark sat in the chair beside Emma's bed, but this time, there was no heaviness in his chest, no fear gripping his heart. Instead, there was something lighter, something unfamiliar but welcome. Emma was awake. For the first time in days, she was sitting up, her small body propped against a pile of pillows, a faint smile on her face as she colored in a new picture. Her pale cheeks had regained some of their color, and though she was still weak, there was a vitality in her that Mark hadn't seen in so long. She was back. His little girl was coming back to him. The room felt different, almost like a different world from the one he had been living in just a week ago. Gone were the beeping alarms and the frantic footsteps of doctors rushing in with grim faces. Now, the machines hummed softly, a steady, reassuring background noise. Emma's heart monitor, which had once been a reminder of how fragile her life was, now beeped in a calm, consistent rhythm. It was a sound Mark had come to cherish. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, watching Emma intently as she drew. She hadn't spoken much since waking up, just a few quiet words here and there, but her eyes said everything. The way they sparkled when she looked at him, the way her small lips curled into a shy smile, it was enough. She didn't need to say anything. On the table beside her bed, the collection of crayon drawings had grown. Some were bright, colorful depictions of flowers, sunshine, and happy faces. Others were darker, more abstract, like the tangled thoughts of a child who had been through something too big for her to understand. But today, Emma was drawing a new picture, one that looked more like the one she had drawn before she got sick, a picture of the two of them standing hand in hand, with the sun shining brightly overhead. Mark felt his throat tighten with emotion as he watched her. He hadn't expected this. Not this recovery, not this chance at a future. The doctors were still baffled, still running tests, still trying to find some scientific explanation for the miracle that had taken place. But Mark didn't need their answers anymore. He didn't need the charts, the statistics, or the medical jargon. He had found his own answer, and it was sitting right in front of him, drawing with bright yellow crayons. The door to the room opened slowly, and Dr. Fisher stepped inside, his expression softer than Mark had ever seen. The doctor approached quietly, his hands tucked into the pockets of his white coat, as if he didn't want to disturb the peaceful scene unfolding in the room. "Mr. Braun," Dr. Fisher said softly, nodding toward Mark. "How are you holding up?" Mark glanced up at the doctor, offering a small smile. "Better than I ever thought I would," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. Dr. Fisher pulled up a chair and sat beside Mark, his gaze shifting toward Emma. "She's doing remarkably well," he said, his tone filled with a mixture of amazement and caution. "We've run more tests, and while we still don't fully understand what's happening, her condition continues to improve. It's nothing short of extraordinary." Mark nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. He had heard those words before: extraordinary, remarkable, unexplainable. But this time, they didn't fill him with confusion or disbelief. This time, they filled him with peace. "I know you don't have the answers," Mark said quietly, glancing at the doctor. "But I think I do." Dr. Fisher raised an eyebrow, clearly curious but not wanting to interrupt. Mark took a deep breath, his fingers tracing the edge of the chair as he spoke. "A week ago, I didn't believe in miracles. I didn't believe in God, or in prayer, or in anything that couldn't be explained by science. But when you told me that there was no hope, that there was nothing left to do, I prayed. I didn't know what else to do, and I wasn't even sure anyone was listening, but I prayed. And now, well, you can see what's happened." The doctor's expression remained thoughtful, his eyes focused on Mark as if he were carefully considering his words. "I don't claim to understand everything," Dr. Fisher said after a pause. "There are things in medicine, in life, that we just can't explain, but I've seen enough to know that sometimes there's more to healing than what we can measure in a lab." Mark nodded slowly, appreciating the doctor's openness. He didn't need Dr. Fisher to confirm what he already knew in his heart. The miracle had happened, whether it fit into the neat boxes of science or not. Emma was getting better, and that was all that mattered. Greta, the nurse who had been there from the beginning, appeared in the doorway with her usual calm demeanor. She offered Mark a warm smile before turning her attention to Emma. "I see someone's feeling well enough to draw again," she said softly, her eyes filled with the same quiet compassion that had carried Mark through the darkest days. Emma looked up from her drawing, her small hand gripping the crayon tightly. She smiled shyly at Greta, then at Mark, her eyes bright and filled with life. "Daddy," she said softly, her voice a little raspy but filled with warmth. "Look what I made." Mark's heart swelled as he leaned in to see the drawing. It was simple, like all of Emma's pictures. Just two figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun. But this one felt different. This one wasn't just a picture of a happy moment. It was a picture of hope, of a future that Mark had been afraid to believe in. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Mark said, his voice catching in his throat. He reached out and gently ruffled her hair, feeling a deep sense of peace settle over him. Greta stepped further into the room, standing beside the bed as she watched Emma draw. "You know," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper, "I've seen a lot of things in this hospital. I've seen people come and go, seen miracles and tragedies. But what's happening here, it's special." Mark glanced at her, sensing the depth of her words. Greta had been there from the beginning, had seen him at his lowest, and had offered him the simple suggestion to pray, a suggestion that had changed everything. "I didn't believe," Mark admitted, his voice low. "Not at first, but now I think I do." Greta smiled, her eyes soft with understanding. "Faith doesn't always come easy," she said, "but it's never too late to find it." Mark sat back in his chair, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. He didn't have all the answers, didn't know what the future would hold for Emma or for him. But one thing was certain. He had witnessed something miraculous, something that had changed him in ways he couldn't fully explain. As he sat there, watching Emma color and listening to the soft sounds of the hospital around him, Mark felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over him. Gratitude for the doctors and nurses who had cared for Emma, gratitude for the prayers that had carried him through, and most of all, gratitude for the second chance he had been given with his daughter. The sun continued to stream through the window, filling the room with warmth and light. And in that moment, Mark knew that whatever came next, he and Emma would face it together, with hope, with faith, and with the quiet knowledge that miracles, however they come, are real. If this story moved you, please leave a comment below to share your thoughts and experiences. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, God bless you.